Hello and welcome to the 6th edition of the Steel Seated Man vlog. Today is a rather special one, October the 25th. That's a day that stands out certainly in my memory. For me it's Balaklava Day, and it's a day, October the 25th, to celebrate the charge of the Light Brigade, the Battle of Balaklava, which was one of the battle honours of my cavalry regiment that I was in when I was in the army. And in the British Army, if you've served in a cavalry regiment that have Balaklava as a battle honour, as I did in the 1318th Royal Hussars, Queen Mary's Own, October the 25th is a very auspicious day, for it's the anniversary. This year it's the 162nd anniversary of one of the most glorious and foolhardy events in British military history, the Charge of the Light Brigade, so immortalised in the epic poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'm sure if you don't know the poem word for word, there are bits that almost everybody knows, into Valley of Death, etc. And the Battle of Balaklava included, as well as the gloriously celebrated Charge of the Light Brigade, also the Charge of the Heavy Brigade, consisting of the 4th Dragoon Guards, the Royal Scots Greys, the Royal Dragoons, the Inniskilling Dragoon Guards and the 5th Dragoon Guards. And not forgetting a regiment that played a pivotal point in the battle, all the action, probably was the shortest one in the whole war, the Thin Red Line of the 93rd Highland Regiment. The charge in the actual charge of the Light Brigade in the North Valley of the Balaklava Heights, the first line of attack was on the left side the 11th Hussars, in the centre the 17th Lancers, and on the right hand side of the front line were the 13th Light Dragoon Guards. In the second line following up were on the left hand side the 4th Light Dragoons, and on the right the 8th Hussars. To the north of the valley there was the 4th Chasseurs d'Afrique, a colonial cavalry regiment. And to the south of the Causeway Heights, the Heavy Brigade, and it's usually a precondition to receive a battle honour that the battle is a victory for the British arms. Balaklava was in fact a strategic defeat. The Russians captured 7 guns and at the end of the battle held all the ground that they had attacked. Against this, the 3 episodes in the battle, the Charge of the Light Brigade, the Charge of the Heavy Brigade and the Thin Red Line action, are such icons of courage and achievement in the British Army that it is not surprising the military authorities awarded Balaklava as a battle honour to the regiments that took part. The Heavy Brigade charged the Russian cavalry on the Causeway Heights, and a stiff battle ensued, and they were actually struggling on the slopes with the Russian cavalry until the 4th Dragoon Guards charged the Russian cavalry's flank and cut through them like a hot knife through butter. The Russian cavalry immediately turned tail and fled back the way they had come, back towards the bottom of the valley and their own lines. The whole action took 4 or 5 minutes, as reported, from the start of the engagement to the finish. So the heavy cavalry certainly did their part by driving off their Russian counterparts in a matter of minutes. There was a second contingent of Russian cavalry who were attempting to advance on the port of Balaklava, but little did they know, in their line of advance the 93rd Highlanders were concealed and waiting, and as the Russian cavalry breasted the heights of the Causeway Heights, the 93rd Highlanders broke from cover, formed line and fired a volley at the Russian cavalry at extreme range. Now surprisingly, or not, because the 93rd Highlanders were a crack regiment, their reputation must have preceded them. After this first volley, the Russians stopped dead in their tracks, turned the cavalry round and fled. Some accounts say that the Highlanders fired a second volley, but the most believed account is that they only fired the one, and that one volley was enough to turn a sizable force of a few thousand mounted cavalry, enough to turn them round and send them packing back home. And that scuppered the Russian plans to take Balaklava. One volley from the Highland Regiment stopped them dead in the track. The Times correspondent at the time, William Russell, He described the 93rd Highlanders action as a thin red line tipped with steel, and that one volley was enough to turn the Russian cavalry and force them to abandon the plans to take Balaklava. As for the Light Brigade, well, the Russian cavalry had been roundly routed previously by the Light Brigade, and a golden opportunity to inflict a telling defeat on the Russian forces was missed because Lord Cardigan refused to send the Light Brigade on a charge into the Russian flank, which would have finished the Russians off. It would have routed them completely. So that opportunity was totally lost. The Heavy Brigade had played its part, and now is the time of the Light Brigade. The order was given to prevent the Russians carrying off the naval guns captured from the Turks earlier. Alright, the British High Command wanted the Light Brigade to go and see to the Russians and stop them taking the guns to the south on the valley. They were captured from the Turks earlier, who, after sustaining a bombardment for a while from the Russian guns, turned tail and fled and left all their guns there. That's what the Russians were after. Now the order was carried to Cardigan from the High Command by Nolan, the bearer of the orders. And when Cardigan asked which guns and where are they, because the Light Brigade couldn't see from the valley floor where they were, they couldn't see just over the crest of the Causeway Heights where these guns were. And when Nolan was asked where the guns are, it's said that he, with some insolence, he flung an arm out and vaguely pointed down to the end of the North Valley where the Russian guns and the retreating Russian cavalry had gone. There is your enemy. There are your guns, my lord. So Cardigan realised that, or thought that he had to go and see to the guns at the far end of the valley. And the staff watched in horror as Cardigan led his Light Brigade down the valley floor at a trot and failed to turn right up the hill and attack these guns that the Russians were after. They just carried on straight into the jaws of hell. The Heavy Brigade followed the Light Brigade into the valley, but as the scale of fire became apparent from the Russian guns, Lord Lucan, who was leading the Heavy Brigade, halted the Heavy Brigade and allowed the Light Brigade to go on their own. And as the brigade passed by the Russian guns up on the causeway, the ones they should have charged, Nolan saw the mistake and rode across Cardigan's front, waving his sword, trying to warn him, but ironically, Nolan was one of the first casualties. He was killed by a shell splinter before he could actually get his message across to Cardigan that the orders had been misunderstood. The Light Brigade had to cover 1.25 miles across this valley floor to get to the guns and the cavalry at the far end. So, advancing at a trot, they came under fire from the left and the right. Cannon and shell, rifle fire. Some began to pick the hussars and lancers and dragoons off. Within 5 minutes, the brigade came into range of the guns at the far end of the valley. And for their Russian gunners, it was easy pickings because they'd got a target 100 yards across, whereas the flanks, the Russian guns on the flanks, had got a target, many hundreds of yards. So it was easy pickings for the Russian gunners at the end of the valley. All they had to do was fire the guns down the valley and they were bound to hit somebody. Casualties in the Light Brigade spiralled as the regiments advanced towards the mouth of the valley, causing the regiments to break into a gallop. All order was lost and it became a headlong dash to get at the guns or to get behind the fall of shot. That was the idea in most people's minds as they charged the guns. But it wasn't just the cannon fire. There was rifle fire, as well as the fire coming in from the flanks as well. So it became a headlong dash to get at the guns. And by the time the Light Brigade got to the guns, they'd already suffered over 50% casualties. What was left of the Light Brigade plunged into the Russian gun line and slaughtered those Russian gunners who didn't turn and flee. So if you can imagine, you've got a line of Russian guns with the Russian cavalry waiting patiently behind them. The 13th Light Dragoons and the right-hand squadron of the 17th Lancers hit the gun line straight on and attacked the gunners and disabled the guns. The remainder of the 17th Lancers and the 11th Hussars on the left bypassed the guns and immediately set about the Russian cavalry, and they chased the Russian cavalry right down to the far end of the valley, to the viaduct. Proper routed them, they did. But the tables turned and the Russians regrouped, the Russian cavalry regrouped, and instead of the Hussars and Lancers chasing them, the Hussars and Lancers became the chased, and the Russians chased them back the way they'd come. Eventually that action finished. The charge completed, the Light Brigade returned by the route it had come. Singly and in small groups they tried to make their way back down the valley to their own lines. Two larger surviving bodies fought off repeated attacks. One of these groups, the largest of them, had 70 mounted men, Hussars, Lancers, Dragoons, just a mishmash of survivors. They drove off repeated attacks by the Russian cavalry, and in fact they chased the cavalry, dispersed them and made them ineffective, thus allowing many of the survivors a breathing space in order to get back to their own lives. And as they made their way back, they were still being fired on by the guns on the north side of the valley. So the French General Maurice directed his 4th Chasseurs d'Afrique, the colonial cavalry regiment, to charge the guns on the north side of the Fediukine hills and silence the fire. This they did with much daring do and skill. They went through the Russian guns and silenced them, put them totally out of action. They lost only 38 casualties, which was quite remarkable, to say that they were riding into gunfire as well, and thus relieving the returning Light Brigade survivors of the fire from the north side of the valley as they returned. On its return, the Light Brigade had a mounted strength of just 195 officers and men, from an original strength of 673. So they lost 247 men killed and wounded, 475 horses killed and 42 wounded, and the 13th Light Dragoons, which was part of my old regiment, could only muster 10 men when they returned to the lines, out of a full regiment. The Heavy Brigade suffered 92 casualties, 9 of whom were killed. The 1st and 4th British Infantry Divisions were now in the valley, far too late to be effective in any way. They were ready to begin an assault on the Causeway Heights, but the order was never given. It was called off. The Russians were left in control of the heights and the road, and the infantry divisions returned to their camps. 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded that day. And the result of the battle? Well, the use of the Woronzof Road was lost to the British for the winter of 1854-1855, making disastrous conditions even more difficult. So that was the outcome of the battle. The charge, which inspired Alfred Lord Tennyson's epic poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. People tend to forget the charge of the Heavy Brigade, which did a lot of good and saved a lot of British or Allied lives. So they were equally as brave as well. And the Thin Red Line of the 93rd Highlanders. What a magnificent effort. One volley and the enemy ran. So there you have it, a potted history of the Battle of Balaklava, Balaklava Day, and why the cavalry regiments, or any regiment that took part in that battle, feel immense pride at that being a battle honour for them. Okay, I hope I've not bored you too much. Don't slip in the blood on your way out. There you have it, the Battle of Balaklava. I'll raise a glass to them. All those who died and took part and survived. Well done, guys. And that's it. That's it for tonight. I'll leave you to it. Bye-bye.